The other day we did a video about how people cleaned themselves in the Middle Ages, which got us thinking about all the other times throughout history when hygiene was not exactly top of mind. So grab your favorite bar of soap, wash your hands, and then watch this video because we're going to take a deep dive into how people kept themselves clean throughout history. Starting with the ancient civilizations, we're going to look at the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Let's start with the ancient Egyptians because they've been dead long enough that you would think they would be stinky. But no. Ancient Egyptians took pride in their personal hygiene. They regularly washed their bodies with natron, a naturally occurring salt, and oils. But they didn't use soap. The concept of soap didn't come around until thousands of years later. But if you were an Egyptian, at least you had access to plenty of fresh water thanks to the River Nile, which overflowed its banks every year, leaving behind nutrient-rich mud that made the land extra fertile. This also provided them with loads of water. The ancient Egyptians weren't afraid of water either, unlike their neighbors, the Israelites. They fully embraced water, and they enjoyed swimming. No wonder the Egyptians became obsessed with preserving their bodies for the afterlife. They thought they'd be swimming in the afterlife, and they wanted to make sure their bodies were ready for the big pool party. The ancient Romans were just as fond of water as the ancient Egyptians. In fact, you could argue they loved water even more. They had public bathhouses where they would socialize and relax and bathe. These bathhouses consisted of hot and cold pools. The patrons would start in the hot pool and scrape themselves with tools called strigils. This scraping removed dirt and dead skin. Then they would cover themselves in oil and scrape again to remove any remaining debris. This process removed dirt and dead skin, but it certainly wasn't sanitary. If you want to learn more about Roman toilets and waste disposal systems, check out our video on that. We'll leave it linked above. Speaking of the Greeks, they too believed in balance. Therefore, they didn't want to get too dirty or too clean. The Greeks believed that cleanliness was important, but it shouldn't interfere with your natural oils. That's why they used olive oil to clean themselves. They would cover themselves in olive oil, scrape it off, and voila, clean. Now, this isn't exactly how you should clean yourself. We would recommend a little more than olive oil, but at least they were trying. What about the Mesopotamians? Well, they're credited with making some of the first sub-like substances. They mixed ash with animal fats to create a paste that was used to clean clothes. Not exactly what you're doing with your bar of dough, but hey, it's a start. And don't forget the ancient Chinese, who believed in keeping things balanced, just like the Greeks. The Chinese used herbal steam baths and rinses. Bathing was considered a form of medicine, and different herbs were used for different ailments. For example, lavender was used to ease anxiety. There was even a special bath that couples could take together to promote fertility. Now let's fast forward from the ancient world to medieval and Renaissance Europe. During this time period, bathing fell out of style in Europe, and this lasted all the way until the Industrial Revolution. Many people believed that water opened the body up to disease, so it was best to avoid it. Yuck. This might have something to do with the Black Death, which killed millions across Europe in the 14th century. But whatever the reason, folks stopped bathing, and instead they started wearing linen undergarments, which they believed could absorb dirt. This meant they could go much longer without washing, and when they did decide to clean themselves, they simply changed their undergarments. Can you imagine how bad those things smelled after being worn for weeks? To make matters worse, the undergarments were often passed around to be used for cleaning, so even if you didn't smell that great, at least you could clean someone else too. Luckily, nobles could afford to have their clothes cleaned and new sets of undergarments. But even they couldn't always escape the smells of the Middle Ages. During this time, the common folk were living in crowded conditions and animals were everywhere. So there was plenty of opportunity to pick up some unwanted smells. The nobles tried to mask their body odor by dousing themselves in perfumes and even putting flowers in their clothes. These days, you can buy plug-ins to keep your house smelling fresh. But back then, they had a trick up their sleeve. Barbershops doubled as bathhouses in many cities. So if you needed to clean yourself, you'd head over to the barbershop. Here you'd be able to wash your hair and maybe even scrub up a little. But these shops weren't the cleanest places. In fact, it was quite common for customers to share tubs with complete strangers. Now, let's jump over to Asia, the Islamic world and indigenous cultures. In Japan, the act of bathing, specifically the communal bath known as but it was also a very serious affair. There was a strict code of etiquette that had to be followed. For example, the water had to be drawn in a specific order, and the body had to be thoroughly washed before entering the bath. Members of the lower class were not allowed to bathe in the same ofuro as members of the upper class. Everyone had their own assigned bath time, and if you were a woman, you could only bathe at night. Speaking of cleanliness, Islam places a huge emphasis on cleanliness. In fact, washing yourself is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Muslims are required to wash themselves before prayer. The ritual wash is called wudu and involves washing your hands, mouth, and face. plus the parts of your body that get sweaty. It's quite thorough and requires about 4 to 6 cups of water. When the Prophet Muhammad first instituted this practice, there was some people said that they didn't have access to that much water, and others argued that it was unnecessary to wash that much. But eventually, everyone came around, and wudu became one of the most important parts of everyday Muslim life. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the Native American tribes used sweat lodges as a form of pure. Sweat lodges were also used for spiritual cleansing and healing ceremonies. They weren't used for cleanliness purposes by every single tribe, but many tribes used them in one way or another. Participants would sit inside the lodge and heat rocks to high temperatures. Once the rocks were heated, they would be placed in a pit in the center of the lodge. Then the participants would pour water over the hot rocks, creating steam. The steam would fill the lodge and the people inside would break into a sweat. After sweating profusely, the participants would lay down and cover themselves in dirt. They would remain still for several hours until they were ready to emerge from the sweat lodge. And what about the Hindus in ancient India? They believed that bathing in a river every morning was a spiritual as well as a physical ritual. It was a way to purify yourself from any dirt or impurities from the previous day. It was also a way to connect with nature and the divine. The most sacred river in Hinduism is the Ganges, but any river or body of water would do for your daily cleansing routine. In early modern times, we see some pretty gross stuff happen. Let's start with the wigs. Back in the day, wigs were all the rage, but they weren't exactly sanitary. They were often crawling with lice and other parasites. The rich would powder their wigs with flour to try and kill off the pests. But you can imagine that this wasn't very effective. And to make matters worse, they would scratch their heads with ivory combs, which spread the lice even further. Next time you see a picture of someone from this era, look closely at their wig. Chances are it's infested with lice. People carried little scent balls in their pockets to help block their own odors. These were usually made of dried flowers or herbs, and they were especially popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. Walking through the streets must have been like walking into a perfume shop. Unfortunately, these little balls weren't very effective. In fact, sometimes they just made people smell worse. Chamber pots were a common sight in the streets of cities. These were the containers that people would empty out of their window. They were usually made of wood or metal, and they were often left in the streets long after they had been emptied. Sanitation was a huge problem in cities. There were very few garbage collection systems, so people were forced to do their own waste disposal. This often meant throwing their waste out the window. It wasn't uncommon for people to step in it, and when they did, they often got angry. Fights broke out in the streets over who had soiled whose shoes. Most people during this time period only washed their hands and face. It wasn't uncommon for them to go years without washing their entire body. For the wealthy, however, it was possible to hire someone to bring in a copper tub so they could enjoy the luxury of a bath. Even still, this was a rare occurrence, and most people preferred to stick with their tried and true method of simply washing their face and hands. It wasn't until the late 1800s that bathing became a common practice in the West again. So count yourself lucky. You're alive today and we have plumbing. Maybe don't take that for granted. Check out our other videos about the Middle Ages and be sure to subscribe.